Hi, my name is Ben Wallerstein. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Whiteboard Advisors. I won't introduce each of my esteemed guests because I'm sure you all can read up on them, and none of us will be offended if you look at your phones. Two are former high-ranking state education officials, and so they can speak with the utmost candor. One still is. We'll show her some grace. We'll see if you can guess who's who. But thank you so much all for being here. Big thanks to Deborah and Michael and the ASU team for creating such a special space for all of us to come together. I'm super grateful to be here. I don't know what year this is, but we'll for me, but we'll get into it. So, jumping into the deep end of the pool, and John, maybe I'll just kick off with you. Are we at a low watermark of educational accountability in K-12 education? Are there real teeth in state or federal policy that are holding our nation's schools accountable anymore? Were there ever?
Pass. That's a great question. We have not rehearsed this, right? So we're rolling. To me, in a way, as much as there's kind of this sense of, well, we took our foot off the gas on accountability, in a way, I'm most concerned about the accountability system that does exist. And it's not to say that I'm against it at all. It's just to say that it reflects our understanding of what needed to exist decades ago. I mean, if you really think about what's in place today, it's a remnant of the No Child Left Behind days. And I think that was an important innovation, but we've learned a lot since then. And in a way, my greatest concern about the politics today has less to do with whether we have feet on the gas or not, because I think, to your point, Ben, you're either going to have a vigorously enforced system or you're not. And I would say, and I'm sitting next to two of the experts in this regard, but if you have a vigorously enforced system, then you're going to have accountability. If you don't, it doesn't matter what the policies are, you're not. My concern is more what the incentives are that the current system is creating, and do we really believe that the current system reflects our best understanding of a student learning and a good education? But do we have the political environment necessary to actually get there to the next stage? And I think right now, of course, the answer to that is no. And I think we should all be most troubled by the inability to evolve, not so much whether the right system is or the harsh enough system is in place.
I'm voting for John White. There were a number of applause lines in there, so feel free to clap if someone says something especially poignant.
Right, exactly. Get in it. I agree with John. In DC, we revised our accountability system. And so in terms of a framework that holds schools accountable, is equity-driven, all of the things, yeah, that exists. But do we have the political will for the accountability, right? Like, everyone supports an accountability system until you're the first loser, and don't tweet that. But that's the tension I think we're living in. And then I also think about high school and how there's like an urgent need to reimagine every aspect of it. And so we're still tinkering at pieces of high school. So, what does it mean to have CTE education on a college campus? What does it mean to rethink seat time? But by and large, I always tell folks I graduated from a high school where my diploma wasn't worth the paper it was printed on, and that's still happening today, and I'm not in high school anymore, right? So I think we have a lot of work to do, but it's very much connected to the political will to do it. And in some places, right, like DC, I can get an accountability framework, I can get resources to launch new programs, I can invest in high-impact tutoring, but that's not happening for every child in this country, and that's deeply concerning and problematic.
So I think there's been a little bit of fear around accountability coming out of the pandemic, that because it was hard and people are tired and, fill in the blank of whatever that might be, that we have given ourselves a pass or an excuse about why we don't need to hold ourselves accountable. And all of that is about adults. And so therefore we have gotten to this place where we lack urgency about where we are supposed to be prioritizing, which are students. And that is losing the point and purpose of accountability, which is not at all about trying to penalize and trying to make it a negative thing. Accountability in its truest form is about saying, here's how we've done, here's how we've performed, here's how we're going to report on it transparently, and here's what we're going to do to make it even better. That's how it's supposed to work. And if we are actually thinking about it now more than ever, it's important to have really strong accountability systems and really strong support systems to continue to elevate the performance of our schools and our students, because we have so much that we have to catch up on, and we should be performing better than we ever have before because our students deserve that. So whether or not we are in a place where folks want to talk about accountability, whether or not we're in a place where we're going to backtrack, we owe it to our students to be stronger on accountability than we ever were before. And it's actually not about evaluations, and it's not about letter grades, and it's not about some report card. It's actually about saying that we have a generation of kids who have lost a lot of their academic performance opportunities, and we are not catching up as fast as we need to. And so we have to have some way to force a sense of urgency and to force a pace faster than we ever have before, even though we're tired, even though it's hard, even though we don't have the staffing, even though the money's going to go away. All of those excuses, we have to break through the barriers and find solutions and not operate as if, but how. How do we get there? And I do think accountability, transparency through data, and a really deep sense of urgency, digging real deep, is the only way we're able to get there for kids. And that's what I really think the conversation needs to be about. And there's all these distractors that get in the way of the true purpose of why this conversation has to matter so much.
Well, let's come back to that in terms of whether we're measuring the right things and what should we be measuring. And certainly that looks very different if we're thinking about third grade reading proficiency or eighth grade mathematics, perhaps, maybe than it does if we're thinking about portraits of a graduate and what students should be able to do or know coming out of high school. But you mentioned high school, Christina. Talk a little bit more about why you see high school as such a critical linchpin. Why are high schools so important? Why now?
Chronic absenteeism and chronic truancy, right? It's the two metrics that everyone can say, oh, it's ballooned, there's a crisis. Well, high schoolers vote with their feet. And so students who are getting a great education, they like the environment they go to, they are loved, support, they have access to multiple pathways to graduation, they're showing up. And students, largely students furthest away from opportunity, are showing up in high schools that are not meeting them where they are, and they're not charting a path for where they could be. And that's why there's such palpable urgency around it. I grew up in the teaching profession around like, oh, every child has to go to college, right? And that might be true, but children also need to explore careers, and they need to explore real careers, careers that are like the subject of this conference and others. And how do we help students be in environments that assure us on the back end that they are learning, that they can go into the world, be good citizens, high wage earners, et cetera, and how is that done in a way where they show up every single day? And so that's why, for me, and I would say for Penny as well, this concept of a new American high school is palpable, and it has to involve advanced manufacturing, access to digital literacy, access to more than computer science, and what you mentioned, a new graduate profile. And you know, this is risky, but concepts around a national graduate profile, because when you graduate from a high school, it shouldn't actually matter if you're in Tennessee or in New York. People should assume that because you graduated in this country, there's some alignment that around what you learned, what you're able to do, because we exist in a global market. And so that's why I'm all in on high school, and how do we solve some of those problems in middle school. So if you don't have access to Algebra 1 and you show up and you're in 10th grade, we already know what those outcomes are going to look like in terms of what you could compete for versus other students who solved that in 7th grade. Those are the types of conversations we should be having, but we should be equipping parents to have as well.
And we've been through this before. The high school movement grew out of the transition from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy. More recently, greater emphasis around post-secondary education, 2 years of post-secondary education, not necessarily a 4-year degree coming out of high school as a predicate to participating in an extraordinarily dynamic economy. Just to pull that thread a minute more on high schools, and I'll sort of open this up to the group. Is anybody hitting the leather off the ball? Who's getting this right? Are there things happening in the country that are particularly exciting on the high school front? And we didn't prep this, so we'll give them a minute to think.
So I would say yes, we're in the emerging space. So I will call out my favorites. So I think outside of DC, which is a personal favorite, Indiana and Rhode Island are the three states that I would call out. Indiana's relooking at how they're doing graduation. They've also studied some of the kind of more interesting countries, specifically in Europe, Switzerland, and Germany. They took some folks over there to rethink how they're doing high school. Rhode Island's looking at some of the ways they're doing post-secondary credits and some work-based learning. I'm always going to give credit to Tennessee, but there is some look at what does it look like to have an innovative high school model. So there are states that are doing that, but it is a specialty, I think, of education in this country to have pockets or spotlights of success, but not actually to work at scale and do something to completely change the ecosystem right away. And so we can point to all of these like bright lights or spotlights or whatever we want to call them, but then it takes 10 or 15 years to get to the point where we're actually moving at scale. And that's now the moment's passed and it just takes too long. So I think for us to be able to actually change to a new American high school, to be able to say that yes, every student in high school should have work-based learning, post-secondary opportunity credits, they should graduate with college credits, and they should graduate with a certificate or an industry certification. That should just be a standard expectation. And they have come to high school with a different set of expectations of school than maybe I did or we did. That can happen actually within 2 or 3 years. It doesn't have to take 10 or 15, but I think those are some of the states that are doing that right now, and they should be models for how we reinvent high school right now to happen for incoming 7th and 8th graders who will start in 9th grade. And I wouldn't just say high school, I actually kind of, now that I'm on the higher ed side, higher ed has got to completely shift because it is just not where our students need us to be in higher ed in order to be where they need to be for career.
Tell a friend. Yeah, and I want to underscore that only in the fact that we've done all those things in DC in 2 or 3 years, right? Redefined a graduate profile, tripled our investment in dual enrollment, created an advanced technical center where students are being taught by university faculty, credentialed courses of study that are dramatically changing their path. They're coming into these centers, getting their credentialing, and then going to high school and doing their high school credit, and then having access to not just internships, but advanced internships with employee partners that are committed to not just, spending time with our students, teaching them to make copies, but they will employ these students when they graduate from high school, and then having university partners that if you did the nursing pathway, you now will have a scholarship to pursue your nursing degree, so that these experiences are either free of cost or low cost, and that was done within 2 to 3 years. And so it's possible to dramatically rethink high school if you have the right set of stakeholders. I know you're going to get to that, like who should be at the table, but it is possible. I think we tell ourselves it's going to take 5 years, 10 years, but if we actually got some of the adults out of the way, you actually can move quite fast on behalf of children.
That was an applause line, too. John.
And I quit my job, so I feel like I can say funner things now than I did the last time we had this talk.
Right.
Let me provide maybe a bit more of a cynical take, and I say this as a high school person. In high schools, we are very, very good at complying with the dictates of policymakers. And in some sense, when you really look at what the average high school does at its essence, it is trying to achieve, in the public school system, the kind of maximum standard outcome as prescribed by the policy context in the most efficient way possible. And this horrible term, the master schedule, really is that's the engine within the high school in most places. And it's a function of efficiency to achieve a standard outcome. And why am I saying that as a matter of kind of cynicism? It says nothing about the outstanding reforms in Rhode Island and Tennessee and Washington. But it is to say, I think we can't just allow, to Penny's point, what happens on the day after after the diploma, the day that the kid walks off here and then wakes up the next day and wonders what next. Unless that changes, the incentives, the stimulus, the context for whatever that high school defines as success won't change. And for a certain subset of kids, even a better performing higher ed system in its conventional baccalaureate orientation is not going to be the right option for 1,000 different reasons. But if I were to fault the kind of skills to work movement, and I think we can say the skills to work universe represents a large segment of the people who are, and I'm one of them, in attendance at this conference, it is to say that the kind of boot camp model that presumes that the incentives are right for corporations to upskill large segments of people who don't have the conventional baccalaureate or other credentials, that works for that 18 and 19-year-old who's not going to Southern or LSU or University of Tennessee at Knoxville or UDC or whatever it is. That's wrong. Like, I actually don't think right now that anything approaching a scaled system of connecting that young person to economic prosperity is in place. It's in place in tiny pockets around the country. But high schools are not adequate staffing agencies. It turns out colleges are not good staffing agencies either. And what that basically means is that very, very low wage, oftentimes no benefits having, no kind of promoting work is a holding place for young people, presuming they're employed, to kind of prove their working history in advance of the incentives really lining up. It's a lot more economically viable to train a 23-year-old with 5 years worth of work history, even low-wage history, than it is to step in and take a risk on an 18-year-old. Until we figure out how you have a scaled experience for that 18 or 19-year-old who's not going to participate in the higher ed system but has done everything possible to satisfy the requirements of the high school, which is a relatively new phenomenon. Remember, if we were having this conversation 25 or 30 years ago, we'd be calling that kid a high school dropout. That kid's not a high school dropout anymore. He's a high school graduate. But he's not, for whatever reason, and there's a million of them, persisting through the college system. And we have no scaled answer for that. Until you solve that problem, I don't think the high school can really fulfill its mission because it has nothing to graduate that young person into. And that, I think, is the greatest crisis, in a sense, facing high schools.
Well, and even just the concept of graduating into starts and stops and the sort of linear nature in which education and learning is often prescribed through policy is both problematic. On the perhaps more optimistic side of things, some of that's eroding, right? Like so you know, Tim Knowles and the team at Carnegie Foundation are working to sort of like undermine and replace the Carnegie unit. Which is like funny and sort of ironic, but if you even if you think about like iPads on the postgraduate side of secondary school, and I think about kids that I grew up with, like if you finish high school when you're, you know, let's say 18 years old, and you go to work at Chipotle. Well, now you might also get you might have tuition-free college through Chipotle or through, say, Starbucks, right? So then you're you know, like if I went home at Thanksgiving from my four-year institution, I met kids who were, you know, saw my buddies who were in community college. Maybe they're 3 years into community college and they're working at Chipotle. And you sort of say, oh, you know, and they felt like they were a failure. And from a public policy standpoint, we view them often as a failure within this sort of like time-prescribed system. But gosh, like, let's say it takes you 10 years to get a bachelor's degree, and you're working at the same time. So you're 28 years old, you have 10 years of job experience, you have no debt. Yeah. Like, that's a pretty terrific foundation. Yes. But how do you move along that path when the stigma and the political and the ideological and policy pressures suggest that you're failing that whole time?
Well, you have to change the payer.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think this is the kind of thing that we all want to dance around, which is, you know, the payer certainly can be the employer to some extent, but the payer for that young person, that kid in North Baton Rouge in the Ninth Ward of New Orleans, who's done everything we've asked her to do, but who, for whatever reason, isn't part of the paid system that we call the Pell Grant,
yeah,
or in Louisiana, the Top Scholarship. Who's the payer for that kid? Because it's not really going to be the hospital in every case, or the construction firm in every case, or the coding boot camp, and ultimately IBM or whatever in every case. And the outliers on this, you know, the IBMs, the Accentures, you know, they're doing incredible work, and we should. But the scale is so limited. We have to work out who the payer is, and to acknowledge that on some level, be it the states or be it the federal government, the government is going to have to be a payer if we're going to foment a system that a high-quality high school in DC or anywhere else can graduate every child into. And to me, that's the biggest variable in terms of whether we create great high schools. great high schools align with great next steps, and we don't have great next steps for a lot of kids.
And the reality is the government's going to be the payer one way or the other. And so I think that's a reality that most people don't want to grapple with. So we use some of our recovery dollars to stand up last dollar scholarships for 1,500 residents. It's an $11 million investment. And to your point, the average age was 26. So we have to tell ourselves dramatically different stories around what 18-year-olds do if we have not immediately put them on a path to something. They are getting work, they're raising their children, they're getting married, but when you showed up at UDC, Trinity, some of our best universities were participating, and they were there, getting their first credential, exploring higher education, and the government is the payer. And it's the right investment, because they will be credentialed by 30, but they will have wages that they can sustain themselves, and that's different than if they end up incarcerated. Then the government is the payer, arguably, for the rest of their lives.
Hopefully not. The by the way, I live in Birmingham, Alabama. My mayor, Randall Woodfin's going to be here later today, tomorrow.
Well, where are you from, Ben?
I grew up in Connecticut,
Okay.
Norwalk, Connecticut. I told my wife I was from Southern Connecticut. It's true. So back to government's the payer, and just to tease out something Penny was saying earlier, I think there's just a foundational question of like, what's the government buying? Or what does the government think it's buying? Because that's what drives accountability, right? Like ESEA grew out of, war on poverty era, which followed the desegregation era. We're still in it, right? Like, and it was fiscal equity, right? Like, because we thought that if we put more money into schools in a more equitable manner, we could get better outcomes. But so much of the federal accountability infrastructure is based on this, like, what are we getting for our money? How do we know? The Carnegie Unit was about pensions, right? Like, how do we know if people are actually doing stuff so that we can hold them accountable and prevent waste, fraud, and abuse? But what should we be holding states and districts accountable in exchange for federal funding? And we'll get to fiscal cliff and ESSER dollars in a minute, because I think we should always give people what they're looking for.
So a couple things. So I think, I'm a big fan of, there's kind of three parts in anything, where you have the policy, you have funding, and you have implementation. And all three of those have to be in place or it doesn't work. And so one of the things, and we can use the high school as the example, is if you have, let's say you have a policy where you allow for some kind of innovative high school model, you can have funding that actually incentivizes good decisions. And so one of the things that we did in Tennessee, for example, is high school funding actually incentivizes completers of CTE programs, but you get more money if students are actually in programs that are high wage or high potential, and those are actually linked to your local community colleges. But on the other end, on the accountability side, you get more money for students who are low income, students with disabilities, and English learners if they hit certain outcomes in elementary, middle, and high school. Now, there are states that are not going to agree with that, and there are states that are going to agree with that. But what we have found is that from an incentive perspective, you can have your letter grades, your accountability system, which is all stick and penalties, but you have to have some kind of carrot. You have to have something that on the other end is going to incentivize behavior, because accountability and money incentivize behavior. There's also the do-gooder and the I want to do good for kids, and we can have that as truth. But you also have money and accountability. So if we're going to have the accountability side, how can you also provide additional funding? And so for high school, if students are in post-secondary credits, if they are completers in their CTE programs of study at high academic levels, and those CTE programs of study are leading to good paying jobs for students or an advantage to be able to complete for whatever post-secondary opportunity they're going to go after. And for students who are oftentimes not completers, we're giving you even more financial incentive to complete. That's something that you can do that's totally within the control of the state agency at the K-12 level. You have to have that repeated then, though, at the kind of your community colleges, your universities, your technical schools and trade schools. That's all within government. but your businesses, your community organizations, your nonprofits, there has to be alignment across the board, and that's where it gets really, really tricky, because oftentimes everyone wants to have their own way of approaching something, and to have that level of cohesion and alignment is almost impossible. And so the kind of leadership that it takes within the state level to say, this is what we're doing and this is how this has to go, to be so precise and cohesive from a policy perspective is where I think it breaks down. So what you can do is within the education system get that kind of alignment, but then to have everyone else kind of play that part is where I think it gets really difficult.
Are there, you're talking about sort of like policy innovation and creating fiscal incentives within the existing infrastructure. Something that's been on my mind a bunch is sort of like policy innovation, and whether we're in sort of like a slack water of policy innovation. I live in a state now where there's a big push to expand the number of charters, where there's, you ran a district. I used to live there too. I think that's what you're getting at. Sorry,
Yes.
took me a minute.
Ben.
Proud DCPS parent for many, many years. But like charters reflect a political and policy compromise that occurred a long time ago in places like Minnesota and Pennsylvania. So I wonder, setting aside sort of things like fiscal incentives or creating weighted funding within an existing infrastructure, are you seeing areas, ESAs are gaining in prominence, but are there other areas of policy innovation that you think could begin to change the way change the parameters in which we're operating?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the great opportunities and kind of tragic ironies of the last 5 years is that the science of reading movement was fueled by what everybody in this room wants, which is hard statistical evidence with the best effect sizes put in the hands of brilliant policymakers who lead their state toward action, and it's embraced by local educators, it's embraced by the commercial sector, and we have, voila, good stuff at scale that's evidence-based. I mean, who doesn't want that? What's so odd is that, red states, ours, blue state-ish,
We're blue.
all did this together. And yet, at the same time, the federal government is cranking out billions of dollars exactly for that purpose, seeking no ultimate legislative, regulatory, or even, frankly, reporting changes. And that indicates to me that while there may be good ideas in policy innovation, and there is, where ultimately the legs need to exist for the policy to run is in the fundamental framework. And the fundamental framework is, today, No Child Left Behind. I'm not in districts, frequently, where they are oblivious to the need to raise test scores, for example. And that is a remnant of No Child Left Behind. That's not ESSA, that's not Race to the Top, that is going back 25 years to No Child Left Behind. They all want better test scores. Great. What they're not seeing is deep, deep levels of accountability coming out of this push for actually kids in the earliest years to learn how to read. I mean, it still is a third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade reading accountability system and not an early grade reading system. So why is that? Because the states are kind of taking it up to the line where they can, in their view, kind of push it. But what they're not getting is the federal leadership to put it within that NCLB framework. It used to be, I think in the best days that you're alluding to, Ben, that state leadership at that level would trigger a kind of political awareness among lawmakers in Washington that, and certainly among corporate and philanthropic leaders, that would make us want to codify this into, to use Christina's words, a kind of national framework. But we have lost that muscle. And there's a lot of reasons behind that. But so when you think about what are you buying when you're the federal government, when you're a US taxpayer, I'd like us to buy a basic good education for my kids. That's what I'd like us to buy. And to me, part of that is teaching my kids to read. And these guys, and my state too, have done a good job in putting in place a framework. So question, I don't think anybody disagrees with that. I don't think there's any parent or teacher that disagrees with that. Learning to read early is a hallmark of a good school. Why is it not in the American accountability system? And why? Because our politics are broken and education is not a good issue to run on in a constructive sense any longer.
That deserved an applause. I mean, particularly as someone who is fighting very hard to implement the science of reading, and it should not be that hard.
What are the hardest dimensions? So, I mean, you have what some people perceive to be draconian measures in terms of ending social promotion or promotion in third grade. You have things like transportation challenges around like summer reading programs. You have the like professional learning piece. How do we elevate the profession and support educators to do the things that they need to do and that the evidence tells us are effective. We have the like wait to fail model. It's easy to pump resources into third grade and even intervention in later years, but gosh, we sure don't spend a lot of money on like robust observational assessment and the things we know that are ultimately effective at the K2 level. But like, what are the real barriers that you see today?
I'm going to let Penny say the spicy thing because I'm still a state superintendent for 2 more months. But I would say
I'm glad I got that right when you said that because I was like, oh gosh.
Yeah, but I would say the challenge is, and I'm trying to remember the organization, but they did a survey, and every parent thinks their child is doing just fine.
Yeah.
Every parent. And so if parents aren't keenly aware of the learning deficiencies of their own children, it's very hard to then hold the teacher, school, et cetera, accountable. Then you have individuals like us that, on any given day, we're reporting out things that people don't want to hear. You don't want to hear you're 20th. You don't want to hear you're dead last. Everyone wants to come in first, but there's a huge disconnect between the work that has to be put in place to ensure that your child can read, that can ensure, and to have the difficult conversation to say, you may need to repeat third grade. You may need summer school. You may need the following things. And so I think those real conversations that for some of us in this room, we had those report card nights where the information wasn't great and no one got a trophy. I think we have to really think not just, state to state, but as a nation, how do we face the reality of just how much work needs to be put in to ensure that our children are learning in school. And then it stacks into a policy framework. I became a teacher in a state where I was required to have a license to teach, and it had to be renewed on a regular cadence. I had to prove that I was credentialed enough to stand in front of a child and disseminate information. But we've moved away from even wanting to discuss licensure. They're like, there's a teacher shortage. Anyone can stand in front of a child. And that's unacceptable because we also want to treat it like a profession. And through the pandemic, anyone in this room that has children knows and has learned that school is not glorified babysitting. And so I do think we have to start to think about the fundamental things that must be in place. Are the teachers trained and ready to stand before children? Are we using high quality instructional materials? Are we basing our literacy instruction in the science of reading? And then how do we have conversations with parents, particularly parents who have been failed by the school system, on how do they get themselves upskilled, and then how are they ensuring that their children can read, right? And that seems like a very simple sentence, but it's extremely complex, even in a very progressive city like Washington, D.C.
Sure, and I worry about that. I worry about that all the time, and it's whether we have the stomach to sustain the measures that might make a difference. That was certainly a big part of the resistance to No Child Left Behind. It called schools ineffective that had a blue ribbon in front, because maybe they were effective for a large swath of students, but they weren't effective for a significant chunk of students within those schools. So we've got 6 minutes and 49 seconds.
Oh,
wow. I could go all day with the three of you. This is fun. Fiscal cliff. How bad is it going to be? Christina, you talked a little bit last time we were together about some of the measures that you've put in place in DC and sort of your approach to fiscal management and budgeting. So I don't know if we should start with you. I know you all are spending a lot of time with leaders around the country, but let's just talk a little bit about what that looks like. So we had, federal government call it $18 billion a year in Title I. 190 almost in stimulus, so a decade's worth of money that had to be spent in about 5 years, setting aside what we got for our money. Talk about what the implications are of that funding winding down and how it will affect states and districts.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I mean, grateful to the federal government for at least allowing for late extension, because I do think there's a collective reality that any system, in DC we received a little over $600 million. Through procurement alone, you can't spend resources that fast well. And so we have spent a lot of time with all of our LEAs being laser focused on 7 different strategies and ways that we should be leveraging money, primarily now on academic acceleration. And so you'll see us making investments in high impact tutoring, quality instruction materials, et cetera. But right now we are literally looking at every single plan on how they plan to expend the last amount of dollars that they have and making sure that LEAs are making right decisions with those resources. And DC is fortunate. We were a resource-rich city before the pandemic. Yes, we are in the middle of, a financial, we have a challenging budget this year, but we are not like other cities and districts across the country, because we will be able to navigate ourselves through this in a way that won't dramatically break our system. That is not going to be true for lots of systems across the country. And that's because primarily in DC, we didn't use our recovery money on, asbestos abatement. But there are certain cities across this country that use a large amount of their resources just on facilities, right? We were opening outdoor gardens and reopening our school system and really thinking about accelerated learning because we had a strong system before the pandemic hit. And so I think those are realities and tensions that many states and cities across this country are going to grapple with, and it's going to create further academic gaps for children. In fact, you see that in certain systems, the achievement gap widened. And students who did well before the pandemic did well during the pandemic, and they're doing well now. And so those are going to be really hard realities that we're going to have to face on the other side of this. But
yeah, I mean, I think I'll keep it quick. In Tennessee, one of the things I'm really grateful for is we redid the funding formula in advance, and putting in the additional kind of 22% in state funding was equivalent to the average of what our districts got in ESSER year over year. And so for states that have not done that, I actually do think this is the perfect time for funding reform, because it really is about how do you kind of manipulate and look at your budget in a way that is about student outcomes. I do think, and we haven't gotten to this, but just the big elephant in the room is politics has gotten in the way of so much of the conversation, and how you spend your money, how you spend your time, how you focus on and should not be focusing on what's happening in classrooms and schools. And so when we're talking about a fiscal cliff, while it is being overshadowed by all of the peripheral that has nothing to do with having a student read and do math on grade level, you are mixing up too many things that complicate what is already a very hard job that I don't think we respect enough. And so what I think is going to be necessary is we needed to spend money on one-time funds. I don't think we spent necessarily the money as appropriately and getting the return on our investment as we should have. But how do we help schools and make strategic decisions and guide them to figure out what worked, constrict the spending to invest in our students so that we can continue to accelerate, and help support our leaders that are turning over at rapid paces to have strategic discipline to just keep focusing on students and know that we are backing them with their school boards, with their legislatures, with whomever else, so they can focus on kids and not worry about losing their jobs. Because right now, people are so worried about keeping their jobs, they're not focusing on kids, and that is a shame for public education. And we've got to do a better job on that before we worry about a fiscal cliff, because we won't have the leaders in place to balance the budgets.
And it's everything she just said. And that's my biggest fear, that we're going to spend the next 6 months actually not talking about can children read, and which state did which amount and who's going to be placed for. The educators did not cause the pandemic. Yeah. And in ways that most people in this room will never appreciate, people gave their all to reopen schools, to educate children, to bring them back, to keep them safe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that is going to hurt the public education system if educators are attacked on the other side of this. And I have palpable fear that we're going to spend all of our time in the fall arguing and not really actually focusing on how we ensure our children are learning.
Yeah. Quickly. I think one, and I'm sure a lot of people in this room are experiencing this, I think in the commercial context, it's going to be a serious change. And I think that, in a sense, the further you are from being core to the to the teachers and the kids and the administrators' experience, the harder that that's going to be. I know that that's a reality that many of us in this room are wrestling with now. Second, I actually just sat through an incredible talk that Alicia Johnson in Indianapolis and Marguerite Rosa at Georgetown gave with some friends of mine from Alvarez and Marcel that I was a part of. And what I learned from Alicia and talking through her process is this is going to look very, very different depending on the financial fundamentals and the quality of leadership. If you use the stimulus money to mask underlying financial problems, and if you've been unable to lead your school board through, and whoever else, through those financial realities, this is going to be a pain point. But that's not the case everywhere. You know, in many places, the financial fundamentals are great. Yeah. Tax receipts are still really strong. The economy is still really strong. Unemployment's really low. So the fundamentals can be there if the right kind of leadership is there. And in those cases, they're going to be fine.
Yeah. In conclusion, I hope you'll all just join me in thanking these three leaders. I'm not going into public service anytime soon. I'm sure most of you aren't. Christina in particular, the kids and families in the district where I used to live are so much better off as a result of your leadership. Penny and John, you're two people that I admire greatly and who probably have the scars to show for the work you did standing up for kids when it was tough. So just super grateful that you're all three here, and it's a pleasure and an honor to listen and learn from each of you. Thank you.